Now, this is a topic that's been argued by a lot of different people, and the opinions vary pretty wildly. I've seen people go as far as to say that Battlefield 1 is completely unrealistic and nothing like what really happened, and I've seen people turn the opposite way and say it's absolutely 100% realistic. And we're going to take a little bit of a deeper look into that. Now, remember, this is a game, and it's made for entertainment, not education, and if you really want to learn about what happened in the First World War, or really learn about what happened anywhere, you should learn about it in an educational setting, not an entertainment setting. Now, first of all, when you first jump on the game, you see all the flag markers and the markers above the enemies' heads when you spot them and stuff like that. And of course, it's not really realistic, but if you take a look at hardcore mode, it does have a more real look, and if that's kind of what you're looking for, it's pretty interesting, pretty fun. Now, when we get into how realistic Battlefield 1 is, the first thing we have to talk about is the weapons. There were very few SMGs used in the war. They were really only used for trench raiders like the Sturmtruppen and the RDT. And I do recommend looking them up for yourself because they're actually pretty interesting. Also, there were very few bayonet mounts that were placed on SMGs. I mean, I've never actually seen a World War I SMG with a bayonet, or even a bayonet mount for that matter. There were almost no shotguns actually used in the war. Towards the very beginning of the war, they were used, but they stopped being used, and it's pretty interesting why. They were actually against the Geneva Convention, but as we all know, pretty much everything that happened in the war was against the Geneva Convention. But they also found that shotguns being used in trench warfare wasn't really that efficient at the time. They would rather you have a bolt-action rifle where you could fire all the way across no man's land and do it effectively, right? But later on, towards the end of the war, when the United States had joined, it got a little bit different. They actually found some effective ways of trench raiding with the shotgun. They kind of had a new look at it because they had just joined the conflict, and they also had been through a war that had some trenches and trench warfare in it, the Civil War. Self-loaders were kind of limited. They were still used, but they're not really as powerful as a bolt-action rifle, simply because in a bolt-action rifle, all the gas is going into the bullet rather than any of it going back to reload the weapon like a self-loading does, so they weren't really 100%. Also, there was some mechanical issues with self-loaders, a lot more moving parts. A lot of rifles had bad mechanical problems back then, being jammed, getting in the mud and stuff like that, just getting dirty, so they weren't as efficient. LMGs were kind of limited, but they were somewhat useful. It's pretty realistic the amount of LMGs being used, around one per squad, which is like 1 out of 4 to 5 people. It kind of makes sense, They're really effective at when you would take an enemy trench and you could quickly get an LMG to that trench faster than you can get a regular machine gun set up, so you could really fast defend the trench you had taken from reinforcements coming to take it back. Now, talking about machine guns, we have to talk about good old heavy machine guns. They should be a lot more useful in the game. They were used on a massive scale in World War I, and if you've ever jumped on one, you know that they suck. They seem to be really low damage, and I mean, you can just tag an enemy so many times and nothing happens. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous. Maybe put them under more cover, maybe give them more damage, faster firing, I don't know. But it's pretty crazy. The use of foreign weapons was actually pretty common. It was still very limited, but if you could pick up a Gewehr that worked more effective than the British rifle that you were given, probably the SMLE, but they were given a lot of different rifles. A lot of them were pretty bad. And if you could pick up an enemy rifle that maybe fought or shot the same cartridge, or maybe shot something that you could be given, then why not use it? I mean, it seems like a pretty good idea, and they actually did that a little bit. Standard issue, though, is a lot closer to being real, as it totally takes out SMGs and shotguns, and it limits self-loaders and LMGs, and it's pretty close to being real, especially if you play a hardcore standard issue game. Those are really, really fun. Grenades are actually pretty close. You know, frag grenades, including the German stick grenades, incendiary grenades, impact grenades, which I really wish they had the disc grenades when you play as the British. That'd be really cool. They're really cool. LT or light tank grenades, you know, weren't really used a whole lot by the Entente because the Germans just didn't have a whole lot of tanks. I'll get to that later. Gas grenades are actually kind of rare. Gas was mostly used in artillery shells and like shot from like large canisters that would kind of just be sprayed from one trench to the other, and the wind would carry it over there. You could only really use it in the right wind. Although, if you look at the gas, it very easily could be the cross of chlorine and phosgene gas, which would be green as the gas is, and it is super deadly. I've heard a lot of people complain about how deadly the gas is, but this actually is the reality of a lot of the gas used, especially phosgene. Despite the grenades being real, the amount of grenade spam, and I know everyone's up in arms about this, the amount of grenade spam after Ammo 2.0 is absolutely ridiculous. It was, you know, and maybe they're making up for the lack of artillery, and I'll kind of get to that a little bit more too. Both gadgets and melee weapons are pretty realistic. You know, innovation was a key, and new technology produced some very strange new weapons and gadgets, you know, and yes, rockets were used in some very rare cases. However, the anti-tank grenade would only really be used by the Central Powers. Since the Germans were the ones that used the stick grenades, they would, you know, naturally have the tops that connect all to one stick and make a big stick grenade, right? And they rarely employed tanks, whereas the other side was pretty decent at getting tanks onto the field. So it's not like, you know, the Entente would really want to use stick grenades against the Central Powers, who didn't really have, or tank grenades, I'm sorry, who didn't really have tanks. I mean, it wouldn't make much sense. Sniping is pretty close. A lot of people have a problem with just popping out and getting sniped right off the bat, and it's kind of easy and whatnot. And, you know, they'll tell you, well, the guns manufactured a lot, and they weren't really that efficient, they weren't really that accurate. But that's not really 100% true. They did malfunction a lot, and some of them were somewhat inaccurate. But for a sniper, that's a little bit different. Snipers were actually given incredibly high-grade, high-quality ammo that would not cause the guns to fail as much as you know, they usually would. And this is why you can look and see a lot of snipers just not complaining about some like horrible guns that just were not effective at all, and the snipers would be perfectly fine with it. And a lot of the countries at the time actually were really confused by this. Go figure, they're confused by everything. Now, artillery caused around 75% of all casualties in the war, and there's very little focus on artillery in the game. Probably because, you know, just running through the map and getting blown up by a random explosion just isn't really that fun, you know. You play FPS games, first-person shooters, for the gunplay, for the shooting, right? So I see why they didn't put a whole lot of focus on artillery. I still wish that they could put more into it, you know, but, you know, I get it. Maybe make the mortars do more damage or something, but, you know, or add howitzers to more maps or whatever. Elite classes, the Sentry is actually pretty realistic, but it was mostly only used by the Germans. It was somewhat used by like the Italians and whatnot, and the armor seems a bit thick for lobster armor. Lobster armor was used, but like I said, the Sentry seems a bit thick, and the helmet definitely seems like ludicrously heavy to be running around with. The Flamer, like the Flamer class, flamethrower class, whatever, was only really used by the Germans, and it wasn't really used for a tactical advantage or anything. It was just kind of used for like a psychological effect to try and kind of drop the morale of the enemy, you know. The anti-tank class is pretty realistic, and yes, you know, the Entente would take the anti-tank rifles, often using them against the Central Powers in several different ways, and so you know, it makes sense for both sides to have access to that, and it's pretty cool. We have to go on to the maps. Now, trenches are not featured near as widespread as they should be. Later in the war, towards the second half of the war, and this is when the game is based, every single village, hill, bunker, field, whatever, on the Western Front had trenches and several rows of them. Now, I get it, trench warfare just wouldn't really be fun for an FPS, but personally, I think it might be pretty fun. Why not add a little one map or something that kind of gives you a real idea of what it was like? I mean, come on. Some of the Italian fronts, like Monte Grappa, is actually pretty realistic with the trenches. There weren't a whole lot of trenches on the Italian front. They are still used in a pretty large amount, but it was kind of hard to dig into the Appalachian Mountains, which is where the Italian front was, because the Appalachian Mountains are mountains. They're very rocky. You can't really dig into it. There seems to be little to no trenches on the Middle Eastern maps, and that's not the reality at all. Trenches were used on like every single land front in the war, so they should definitely have been used on some of the Middle Eastern maps as well. I mean, personally, I think that'd be pretty cool. I really like when there are trenches in the game. It adds a lot of just close combat and trench warfare. That's kind of what the game is based on. Obviously, there are a few, but there's just not as much as there should be. The powerful concrete fortifications are pretty realistic, especially on maps that feature the Germans, because they built a lot of concrete fortifications, and yes, they would sometimes be completely destroyed by artillery and explosives. Mud should definitely play a bigger role in some of the battles. Mud was actually so important to the war on the Western Front that, and this is pretty crazy, some soldiers literally drowned in mud. Now, maybe they shouldn't take it that far, because that'd be pretty boring just to run into some mud and just sink till you drown. And I mean, that wouldn't be fun. I wouldn't play the game if that's how it was. But to give you an idea of how much flooding there was actually a few very rare instances where both sides on the Western Front would fight each other in little boats as no man's land and the trenches were completely flooded. Wouldn't that be fun? Wouldn't that be a fun Easter egg? Like just like one day, just for one day, make that like a thing. That'd be really cool. I think that'd be really fun. Barbed wire was used in No Man's Land, but very little amount of it is actually found on the maps. Just look up a picture of World War I barbed wire, and you'll see exactly what I mean. I mean, there was a lot, like, probably too much. I mean, like, there's so much barbed wire used in some photos, especially on the Western Front, that it looks like a snake couldn't slither through it if it tried, Now, next we kind of got to talk about some of the vehicles. A lot of people have a problem with how weak the tanks are, but this is actually pretty realistic. Tanks were new and had many issues. Just think of them as big, roving metal balls covered in leaky gas and oil. Doesn't really sound very stable, especially if you're having artillery hit around you and grenades thrown at you and being shot at. With that said, I have taken out a light tank completely by myself as an assault class, so, it may be a bit of a stretch, but not as far as you'd think. It is very possible to see a British or French tank being used by the Germans, as they made it a big, thing to kind of capture the enemy tanks so they could actually use them. But the German tanks, such as the A7V, were kind of too rare to really be captured and used. I mean, in fact, the Germans only were able to field about 20 A7V heavy tanks, mostly because of their lack of resources during the mid to late stages of the war after being, blockaded. The artillery truck is pretty in place, but I really wish it had maybe a mortar also, in addition to the cannon, just to make up for the lack of artillery in the game. But I mean, I guess the heavy cannon will have to do for now. Planes are pretty realistic. Once again, people get mad that they're so vulnerable to AA fire, but this is the reality. In fact, I've gone several full games without losing a life in a plane, and that was somewhat rare. Now, I know what you'll say, wait, didn't a few aces live through a few battles? But I must say only a few actually lasted to the end of the war. I mean, even the Red Baron ended up getting shot down before reaching the halfway mark. In fact, pilots had the largest percentage of deaths right, and captures, the largest percentage of casualties in the war. Now, some of my friends have kind of questioned the motorcycle and their sidecars, but Harley-Davidson and Ford both contributed these to the war effort. In fact, Harley was actually preferred as their design encouraged their users to be able to make modifications and repairs on the fly. And these vehicles actually had a pivotal role in transporting wounded troops and taking on scouting missions. Now, next we got to talk about the behemoths. First of all, a lot of people will say that navies had very little to do with the First World War, but that is not at all true. In fact, there were many naval battles, including some very large ones in the Baltic area. Now, how relevant were ships to land warfare? Actually, a lot. In fact, the Ottomans dealt with a couple of large naval barrages on Gallipoli before they were able to push it back. The armor train is also a pretty realistic tool of warfare at the time, as both the Belgians and Germans used them, though I can't really find a time that they were used in the Middle East, as it says, on the story mode and on many Ottoman maps. The biggest no-no with all the behemoths is the Zeppelin. Zeppelins were not at all used on battlefields for fighting. Zeppelins were used for reconnaissance and bombing cities that couldn't really be reached by warfare. And they mostly did that for, the psychological effect of trying to kind of push nations to wanting to not be at war. They were also way too low when seen in Battlefield 1. In fact, Zeppelins were able to fly so high that planes couldn't even reach their altitude. In fact, when the incendiary bullet was invented, they had to fly to their max altitude, fire a couple of shots at the Zeppelin, stall, regain their speed, turn back up, fire more shots, and basically repeat that process just to try and knock it out of the sky. Though, on a side note, the blimps that are seen on some of the maps are pretty realistic. And, by the way, blimps and Zeppelins aren't really the same. So, after watching this video, I kind of hope you learned a little bit, and maybe you might have a newfound respect for some of the more realistic aspects of the game, and maybe you kind of might see, maybe some issues with some of the aspects that aren't real. But, the game is still pretty fun, and I certainly love playing it. If you liked the video, maybe if it taught you something, go ahead and hit the like button. If you want more content, go ahead and maybe subscribe. And, don't be afraid to leave a comment if you have, maybe some evidence that I was unable to present, or if you maybe have a problem with some of the things that I talked about as far as how real they were. I'm always willing to have a conversation about it and kind of talk about it. And with all that said, thank you for watching.